Okay, we are live on YouTube. We are recording. 2 more minutes. Okay, it's 11:05 here on the East Coast. Welcome everybody to a new presentation, a new delight for our monsoon enthusiasts. Today we welcome Kathleen Johnson, who is a geochemist and paleoclimatologist who specializes in speleothe-based paleoclimate reconstruction. Her research focuses on process-based studies, new and emerging speleothe proxies, and development of multi-proxy speleothe records of past hydroclimate variability from seasonal to orbital timescales. Her current study sites include caves in Mexico and Laos and Vietnam, and she will talk about some of these today in Southeast Asia. Kathleen has received the Bachelor of Science in Geological Sciences from the University of Michigan in '96 and the PhD in Geology from the University of California, Berkeley in 2004. She conducted postdoctoral research in the Department of Earth Sciences at the University of Oxford between 2004 and 2007, and is currently an associate professor in the Department of Earth System Science at the University of California, Irvine, where she's been since 2007. In addition to her research, Dr. Johnson is a strong advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the geosciences. She received the 2016 GSA Bromery Award and is a fellow of the Geological Society of America. Welcome, Kathleen. And we're looking forward to this presentation. At the end of the presentation, I will take your questions and we'll proceed from there. Welcome.
Thank you so much. And thanks for organizing this seminar series, which is a really amazing resource for our community. So thanks to you and Peter and Tara. So yeah, I'm excited to share some of our work we've been conducting over the last now 11 years, I guess, in Southeast Asia, focused on trying to fill in that gap that exists in the paleoclimate record of mainland Southeast Asia and understand the variability and mechanisms of monsoon change over a range of timescales. And this work that I'm going to present today has been conducted in collaboration with a large number of people listed here, including several of my students, Chris Wood, Jessica Wang, Hong-Ying Yang, and my former postdoc and close collaborator, Michael Griffiths. Okay, so I think there's no need to dwell on this with this group, I realize, but the future of the Asian monsoon is of the utmost importance to understand, given the high population density in this region. We know quite well that Asian monsoon rainfall is projected to increase and become more variable in most regions, despite an overall weakening of the monsoon circulation. So this thermodynamic component is expected to dominate, along with expansion of the Hadley, some increased convection expected over much of the land area. And however, we still have observations are still not necessarily matching predictions in many places. And we really have relatively low confidence in model projections, in part due to the complexity of the land-ocean atmosphere coupled systems. So things like regional precipitation change, which are really likely to have the biggest impacts on people living in the monsoon regions, are still really poorly constrained by climate models. And you can see here that the projections also show quite a significant amount of, this is a little bit outdated, I need to update this with CMIP6 models, but this is showing CMIP5 projections for the percentage of rainfall occurring during the summer. And you can see that some regions, a lot of the monsoon region has relatively low confidence in the direction of change even. And also there's some regions that potentially could become drier during the summer, including Southeast Asia. So there's many different ways that we can subdivide the monsoon into different systems, as you know. And this is one approach that is based on the spatial precipitation patterns in the region. So this was done by Conroy and Overpeck using instrumental climate data, where they looked at regions of the broader Asian monsoon region, which exhibit some coherence in interannual rainfall variability. And so the Southeast Asian monsoon region, which is outlined by this box here, and also this plot on the right is showing the correlation between rainfall within this Southeast Asian monsoon region with each other. So Southeast Asia rainfall over mainland Southeast Asia is closely related typically and very similarly to rainfall over the Bay of Bengal and over the Indian subcontinent. And this region is quite important in that it sits at the interface between these two major monsoon systems, the East Asian monsoon and the Indian monsoon domain. And yet we have very few paleoclimate records from this region, especially extending beyond the tree ring record. And of course, further motivation for studying paleoclimate as a way to better understand natural climate variability and to better project how the monsoon will change in the future as a response to anthropogenic forcing, as well as internal climate variations, is driven by the huge impact and reliance of humans on the monsoon rainfall for agriculture, industry, basic human needs. And also we've seen increasing extremes in the region, in part potentially linked to climate change, also linked to natural factors such as ENSO, and also exacerbated by the huge development of hydroelectric power in Southeast Asia. So here you can see some images of a huge drought that happened during 2016, which was linked to El Nino, but also exacerbated by dams that were built along the Mekong drainage. And then on the other hand, we also have seen increasing extreme precipitation events in Southeast Asia, also sometimes linked to hydroelectric infrastructure. So here we have, back in 2018, there was, after an extremely heavy rainfall period during the summer monsoon, we had a dam collapse in southern Laos that affected many downstream communities all the way into Cambodia. And then just last fall, about a little over a year ago, Vietnam experienced some historic flooding in central Vietnam, which is another area that we're working that I'm not going to talk about today, but in any case, this was linked to a series of very intense tropical storms that impacted the region. And then just to show a little bit of a connection to our own field site, we've also seen direct impacts on people from extreme monsoon rainfall events. So this is a bridge near one of our field sites in Khammouan province in central Laos. And you can see this bridge was wiped out during flooding about 4 or 5 years ago. And you can see some debris, flood debris up here. And so now the community has built this ingenious little car ferry that we have to use to get across the river to be able to get to one of our field sites. So just demonstrating the resilience of people there in the face of some of these climate changes. Okay, so I realized that there's not been as many speleothe talks during this seminar series, and so I'll give a little bit of background. And I think everyone knows that speleothems have provided a large number of records of past Asian monsoon variability. This is a map showing the location of karst regions globally, as well as the location of speleothem records that are part of the CISL database. And you can see if you zoom in down here in the bottom right, there are many located within the Asian monsoon region, especially in China, but there's relatively few in Southeast Asia still. So this one here, this little dot here, if you can see that, is the site that I'm going to be talking about today. And we are also working on a couple of sites down here in central Laos and central Vietnam, which I'll very briefly mention at the end. Okay, so speleothem oxygen isotopes have been the most widely utilized proxy for monsoon intensity, which I have in quotes there because that means many different things depending on who you're talking to. But in general, there's been much debate over the years about what the dominant controls are on speleothem delta 18, and even though we see this incredibly close coupling with insolation, in this case, it's July JJA insolation shown in this figure from Cheng et al., which goes back over 600,000 years and shows this tight coupling between delta 18 with more negative values during periods of higher summer insolation, interpreted as reflecting stronger monsoons, and more positive values, which are plotted towards the bottom as reflecting weaker monsoons. And then, of course, we see superimposed on that significant millennial scale variability as well that shows up in the delta 18 records. So I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time going through the different controls on delta 18, but they have ranged from, the proposed controls have ranged from pure amount effect, which we think in most is not the situation in most cases, especially in the East Asian monsoon region. The seasonality of the precipitation, so the relative proportion of light summer to heavier winter or spring rainfall has been proposed as a dominant control to explain this. Changes in the westerly jet position, or the timing of the westerly jet transition. So this is John Chang's idea about, this is specifically important for East Asia, where the northward shift of the jet during the monsoon onset allows the isotopically light summer moisture to make it further into China. And then the upstream rainout idea, which was originally proposed by Yuan et al. In 2004, and then modeled by Posada and others since then, is the idea that effectively the delta 18 signal at any cave site is driven by upstream Rayleigh distillation processes that lead to increased depletion when you have a greater amount of rainfall basically between the moisture source region and the cave site. And then also just pure changes in moisture source region, from whether that is linked to, for East Asia, relative contributions from the Indian Ocean versus the Pacific, or whether, if we're thinking about the Indian monsoon specifically, whether the source region is more in the tropical Indian Ocean or more proximal, like in the Bay of Bengal. Okay, so all of these complicated factors together can influence the delta 18 record. And as I mentioned, one of the things that we really want to know about the monsoon is how actual local rainfall is going to change. So delta 18 is not a great proxy for that if we want to look at actual rainfall patterns back in the past. And so one of the things that we have focused on in our group is more of a multi-proxy approach, which includes proxy development studies to understand the controls on things like stable carbon isotopes, trace element composition, non-traditional, sorry, the cat's visiting, non-traditional stable isotopes like calcium isotopes are new emerging proxy, radiocarbon-based isotopes as well. And so this cartoon here, I'm not going to go through each of these proxies in detail, but the main point I want to get across is that delta 18 is driven primarily by the delta 18 composition of precipitation, with some minor impacts from hydrology that can cause a little bit of noise basically in the signal. Whereas C13 and trace elements and these other proxies are solely driven by processes that are happening directly at the cave site or above the cave. So for example, soil processes like the PCO2 level in the soil, the delta C13 composition of soil CO2, which can be linked to both productivity and the C3 to C4 plant ratio, the radiocarbon content of the soil, which is linked to soil organic matter dynamics and turnover times, and all can contribute to these proxy signals in the speleothe and set the sort of initial values of water and the DIC as it's infiltrating into the cave. And then there are hydrologic processes that can happen, or processes that can happen during transport to the cave. For example, degassing in the epikarst region or on the cave ceiling can lead to enrichment in delta C13 as well as in trace elements through a process called prior calcite precipitation. And the nice thing about this process is that it should lead to covariation between C13 as well as trace element ratios like magnesium calcium and strontium calcium. So if we measure all of these, we can kind of fingerprint whether that process is happening. And we believe that that prior calcite precipitation, or PCP, is greater the drier it is. So when we have drier conditions, infiltration is slower, there's more air pockets for degassing in the epikarst, and also potentially a slower drip rate, which allows for greater amounts of degassing within the cave to occur, leading to higher and more enriched delta C13 and kind of magnesium calcium ratios. I'll just focus on that one. And so there are other complicating factors that can be linked to cave environment, crystallographic factors, as well as changes in the cave environment in terms of ventilation, which can impact the degassing rates, and other factors as well. So each of these proxies, of course, has its own complications, but by applying a multi-proxy approach, we try to constrain these processes as much as possible, and understand how the climate signal is translated by the soil in the karst system into the stalagmite values that we've then measure. And so by combining these proxies together with delta 18, we can get more detailed information about sort of large scale monsoon variability from the oxygen isotopes and more local water balance from the other proxies. Okay, and then so moving on to the study site I'm going to talk about today is called Tam Dun Mai Cave, and it's located in Luang Prabang province in northern Laos, shown here by the red triangle. So we first visited this cave in 2010 and have conducted years of monitoring there, although it's been we're not able to go there frequently, especially in the last 2 years. But we will hopefully be going back as soon as we can once the COVID situation improves there. But in any case, this cave is one of the larger caves in Laos, and you can see a map of it here. It's over 3 kilometers long, and it has a very single small entrance up here. And most of the samples that we are collecting are from this upper part of the chamber, which is isolated from the entrance by a small crawl space. So it's has a very stable climate, constant temperature and high humidity, and so on, which are ideal conditions for limiting the impact of processes like kinetic fractionation on our signals. And so we've also done studies of carbon cycling at the cave to better understand the C13 and the radiocarbon signals that we're measuring. So you can see us doing some soil efflux sampling up here for isotopic measurements. Here's my former student Hung Yang collecting some drip water. And we've also been measuring rainfall and water isotopes and precipitation in this region. So this site, as you can see here, this is showing summer precipitation and 850 millibar winds. So this site has a strong, is dominated by the summer monsoon rainfall, with the majority of annual rainfall occurring between May and September, and being sourced from the Bay of Bengal and Indian Ocean, with very little impact from moisture from the Pacific or South China Sea. We wanted to understand and test the isotopic controls at our study site as well. And one approach we utilized was using a nudged isotope-enabled GCM simulation of the 20th century delta 18 variability. So this is the ISO-GSM from Kei Yoshimura model, which allows us to compare the delta 18 with relative realistic climate data to understand the dynamics in impacting the signal. And so we find in this paper by Hung Yang, we found a strong link with ENSO, unsurprisingly, which you can see here. This is a spatial correlation between delta 18 at this cave site and SSTs globally, with zooming in on the tropical Indo-Pacific region. We also find a significant correlation between delta 18 and sea level pressure in the upstream region. So sea level pressure is obviously linked to surface level moisture convergence and convection. So when we have increased convection over our study site, over the upstream regions, we find more negative delta 18. So that's consistent with that kind of upstream right now idea. And then we also see this pattern with vertical wind shear. The dashed box outlines the Webster-Yang region, monsoon index region. So this is U850 minus 200. And we see, again, with stronger monsoon, we get more negative delta 18 values. So that's just supporting our interpretation of delta 18. I should note we did not find any relationship between delta 18 and local precipitation. So we're really interpreting it as this likely upstream rainout signal primarily. Okay, so I'm going to present two different multi-proxy case studies from this cave. First, a 38,000 year record of Asian monsoon and local rainfall response to looking at the impact of insolation and millennial scale variability. And then the second is a Holocene record that revealed a large megadrought, which we linked to the end of the Green Sahara. And so we'll start with this one. And of course, the first step in developing these records after we do the difficult field work involves a lot of sample prep. And so here we have our student cutting some of these stalagmites on the rock saw. We polish them. Sometimes we section them and we either micromill them using the new wave micromill, depending, or a hand drill or a different shoreline micromill, generating a lot of samples, which we then feed into our Keel device or our ICP-MS for trace elements. And then, of course, we construct age models for our samples using uranium thorium dating, which of course is one of the main advantages of speleothems, is that we can get these incredibly precise age models. Okay, so this on the left here is showing the two stalagmites that I'm going to be talking about. Primarily TM17 here in the bottom is what we're basing our interpretation on, whereas TM21, which you can see has a few growth hiatuses, and so did not grow continuously and generally has a little bit poorer age model constraints. We're primarily using that for replication purposes. But TM17 is our prize specimen, which formed between around 38,000 years ago and the present. And each of these blue squares is uranium thorium date, with the error bar is smaller than the symbol. And so we have a really precise age model. It grew around relatively constant rate of around 20 microns per year. And so we can construct a climate record at sort of decadal resolution from it quite easily. So the right figure is showing the stable isotope results from these samples. So the delta 18 record on the bottom is, if you've looked at a lot of these records, you'll notice that it probably looks familiar. We have generally more positive values during the glacial, with positive excursions during Heinrich events. So we have, the sample covers Heinrich stadials 1, 2, and 3, as well as the younger Dryas, and we see the 8.2 event quite clearly in that signal as well. And then we have the TM21 is in gray behind it. And then up here, we have the carbon isotope data, which importantly is also quite well replicated by the TM21 record. And carbon isotopes, because of the additional complexities, if we can show that we see the same signal in multiple stalagmites, that can really increase our confidence in interpreting them as a proxy for local water balance. So the delta C13, interestingly, also shows big excursions during all of the Heinrich events, with something else. I don't have time to talk about it too much, but I'm happy to chat in the questions. We don't quite see the same response in the carbon to the younger Dryas and the 8.2 event. Nevertheless, we note some strong similarities between the C13 and the O18, but also some differences. Most notably, I'll just point out right now that we have this clear different trend during the Holocene, where in the delta 18 record, we see this kind of steady transition that matches up quite well. And I should note, this is July insolation. And so it's steadily decreasing from the early Holocene, indicating a weakening of the monsoon or decreased upstream rainout. And then given that we only have a 38,000 year record, we can't really say too much about the phasing relative to the orbital forcing, but it does appear that it's relatively in phase with either July insolation, or it might be lagged behind June insolation by a couple thousand years, depending on which one of those we think is most important. But during the period of high insolation, we find more positive delta C13 values in the early Holocene, with the most negative values occurring between about 5,000 and 7,000 years ago. So that suggests potentially that the wettest conditions at our site in Laos did not coincide with the period of like the strongest monsoon, based on the delta 18. Okay, so we're going to dig into that idea a little bit more here. So first, we compared our data with several other speleothe records from China and India. So here we have the China composite, we have the Xiaobailong record from Southwest China, and the Indian record from Katayat, along with the NGRIP delta 18 data. And so again, you can see the striking similarity. There certainly are some subtle differences which are interesting to dig into, but overall, the relationship with the Chinese record is quite strong, and we basically confirm that this the fact that we see this strikingly coherent signal across the broad region, at least between China and Southeast Asia, to me is indicative that this upstream rainout mechanism is really important in driving the signal across the broad region. So again, the orbital scale variability is in phase with July installation, and then the millennial scale variability that we see is linked to AMOC. So if we want to look at how regional precipitation changed in Southeast Asia, we need additional proxies though. Okay, and so this is some work that was conducted by my former student, Chris Wood, shown here with one of the resident Lao cat friends that we always, get to know when we're in the field. This is actually just down the river from the Namu River from our cave site. And so here we have a number of different proxies, which I'll kind of talk through a little bit. So on the top, we have the dead carbon proportion. This is actually the proportion of carbon that is derived from the bedrock. And we calculate this based on radiocarbon measurements, paired radiocarbon and uranium thorium measurements, basically. So the offset between the ages can be used to determine how much bedrock carbon that's, of course, radiocarbon free is incorporated in the stalagmite. And so that variability in how much dead carbon proportion is related to closed versus open system dissolution. I should note, we have extremely and anomalously high values here compared to most stalagmites, which we think are driven by pyrite oxidation and sulfuric acid dissolution in this cave system. So some of these, at least in this time scale, some of these aren't necessarily, it's hard to link some of them to hydrology, but we do think that in some cases we can, which I'll explain in a minute. In any case, the understanding how much bedrock carbon is contributing to the calcium carbonate in the stalagmite can also be useful for helping constrain the delta C13 signal. And so that's how it's used in this context. And I'll come back to that. Here we have magnesium, calcium, and strontium calcium data. This is the PC1 of those trace element records, which look very similar to each other. And we see some evidence for drier conditions in the early Holocene, wetter conditions in the mid Holocene based on the trace element data, and some excursions during Heinrich events, but it's not that clear. So the trace elements, the difference between the trace elements and the C13 suggests that they're being at least partly controlled by some different mechanisms. And then we have reflectance data, which is basically grayscale data, which has been shown to be a quick way to quantify crystal fabric in the stalagmites. So lower values, reflectance values, basically represent more dense columnar calcite, whereas the higher values represent the more porous open columnar calcite. And this is work that was done by our collaborators, Sylvia Frisia and Andrea Borsato. And effectively, the more dense calcite will form during drier periods with slower drip rate. And so we do see some evidence of increases in that during these Heinrich events, and also potentially during the early Holocene. And then we have, again, the C13 and the delta 18 records down here. The delta C13 can be influenced by, as I mentioned, prior calcite precipitation, bedrock dissolution, as well as processes in the soil and vegetation changes. So one thing we can do to try and constrain some of that a little bit in terms of impacts on delta C13 is we can model, we would expect if the delta C13 and the dead carbon proportion signals are being driven by bedrock dissolution or water rock interaction, we would expect a correlation between delta C13 and DCP in our samples. And this is showing we used a model called a cave calc model, which is a Freaksy-based proxy system model for speleothems. And we can change, we can model basically closed versus open system dissolution. And what we would find is that the data should, if that is driving the signal, then we should find our data plotting along this trend. And what we see in the data is, this is again the TM17 data. We see that most of the data does plot along this trend. So we have some of the C13 variability can be about 35%, in fact, can be explained by bedrock dissolution. But we also have a lot of variability that must be explained by other processes. And most notably, if you look at this signal for Heinrich Stadial 1, this tells us that that big delta C13 excursion during Heinrich Stadial 1 cannot be explained just by bedrock dissolution. And we also, if you recall, I also noted that the trace element data during Heinrich Stadial 1 doesn't show a big excursion, indicating that prior calcite precipitation may not be the factor either. So by process of elimination, we believe that the Heinrich Stadial 1 signal is primarily reflecting changes in the soil and vegetation zone. So that could be a shift, a strong increase in the proportion of C4 vegetation, and or just a collapse of vegetation in the region that leads to more contributions from atmospheric CO2. And so that's I guess one of our interesting findings. And then altogether, we interpret this multiple proxy record to indicate that Heinrich events were dry at the same time that the monsoon was weak, I should note. So this is the Heinrich millennial scale variability is one example where it seems like the delta 18 and the other proxies are consistent. However, on the orbital timescales, as far as we can tell, we have a dry early Holocene when the monsoon was technically strong, and a wetter mid Holocene when the monsoon was technically weaker, if we're interpreting delta 18 in that way. Okay, so of course we want to compare our data with other records to investigate this further. And so here again, we have our records plotted on the bottom here, the delta 18 and the C13 and the reflectance, along with, this is again July installation. And then we have a few other records shown here, including the Borneo speleothem record, which is interpreted as more directly related to regional rainfall amount. We have the barium calcium from a sediment core in the Andaman Sea, which has been interpreted as a proxy, and this is from Jabra Gorges. Sorry, I'm probably not pronouncing that wrong, but that is reflecting runoff from mainland Southeast Asia via the Irrawaddy drainage. And then we have some records from northern China, the Gonghai Lake record from China et al. And the Northeast China dunes from Li et al. And so I guess what I'm trying to show with this is that if we compare our data with non-delta 18 records, the timing of the wet conditions in the mid-Holocene is more consistent. We see actually a lot of similarities between the Borneo record, interestingly, and our delta C13 record as well. And Borneo has been interpreted as really sensitive to water circulation changes. So that might in part explain some of the linkage. And then the Andaman Sea records, and we need to look further into the salinity records from the Bay of Bengal, which have been presented in this series recently as well. But in any case, we find support that our carbon isotope data is consistent with some of these other records. You might wonder why I included northern China records in here as well, but we know, at least in the modern climatology, that the hydroclimate changes in northern China are in phase with those in Southeast Asia. Okay, so now I'm going to move on. Let me check the time. Okay, now I'm going to move on to just talk a little bit about the Holocene record that was published last year by Michael Griffiths and I and co-authors in Nature Communications. And this focused on variability over different timescales using 3 stalagmites, which are shown here, TM4, TM5, and TM11, also from Tom Dun Mai Cave. And this is work I wanted to highlight that was conducted as part of a wonderful collaboration we've had with archaeologists, including Joyce White here and Bunhung. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce his last name, unfortunately, but Joyce and Bunhung were the co-directors of a large project called the Middle Mekong Archaeology Project, which you could read about more here, that really was a large effort to study the human history along the Mekong, the Middle Mekong region, which has previously been very understudied, and investigate the impact of climate on societal changes and development of agriculture and all of these big questions that are important in Southeast Asia. And this project was really great because it involved a large number of students and researchers from Southeast Asia, many from Laos, but also other parts of Southeast Asia, as well as a large cohort of international collaborators from a wide range of disciplines. So it was through this connection with Joyce and MMAP that we originally went to Laos in 2010. We were invited to join because they realized there's very little paleoclimate records there with which to provide context for the archaeological data. And so here we are with some of our MMAP colleagues on our very first trip, hiking to one of the caves that we first visited. Okay, so based on those 3 stalagmite records, we again developed a multiple proxy record based on stable oxygen and carbon isotopes, trace elements, and also dead carbon proportion, which is plotted here. And so you can see this kind of generally increasing trend over the Holocene, along with this this abrupt shift towards more positive values that occurred around 5,000 years ago. And you can see that it was actually immediately following one of the wettest period of the Holocene that I had recently talked about. We had this abrupt shift from quite wet to very dry conditions. This does show up in the other sample, but it's more subtle because it's just much lower growth rate and resolution and has different hydrology. So this site in the cave seems to be more sensitive to these shorter term signals. In any case, we have this shift towards more positive delta C13, positive delta O18, higher magnesium calcium ratios, and also in this particular sample, you'll see that the dead carbon proportion is much lower, more similar to what we would expect, indicating that this particular drip is not, which is in a different part of the cave, is not impacted by the sulfuric acid dissolution processes that we talked about. So this is more in line with how we can use DCP or dead carbon proportion as a proxy, where when you have drier conditions, you have more air pockets and CO2, more opportunities for exchange between CO2 and the dissolved inorganic carbon pool, basically. And so the DIC stays more in equilibrium with a more modern atmospheric radiocarbon, leading to lower dead carbon proportions in the sample. And so we have these 5 proxies then, oh no, sorry, 4, 4 proxies that are showing a consistent shift during this time period. And through conversations with the MMEP archaeology colleagues, we discovered that this time period is very interesting in Southeast Asia human history, in that it coincides with a significant cultural shift from dominantly hunter-gatherer society to more settled cereal cultivators. It also coincides with a period when there's a significant gap in the archaeological record. So there's a lot fewer dated, radiocarbon dated sites around this time period. And there does seem to also be a shift from continental interior sites to more coastal sites. Although that wasn't really the focus of the paper, and there's other papers in the works that focus more on that story that are being led by our colleagues. But in general, we wanted to, it is possible that this significant drought, which we've called a mega drought, once we've identified that it shows up in lots of other records, it could have potentially played a role in some of those societal shifts. Okay, so you might also think about whether this is really the 4.2 kiloyear event. We're not calling it that because it appears to be much longer. It starts earlier and it lasts longer than just the 4 kiloyear event. However, what we do show over here on the right is a compilation of a number of different proxy records, which have shown shifts towards dry or wet monsoons around 4,000 years ago. And this is mapped onto the spatial pattern of rainfall anomalies associated with strong El Nino events for reasons that will become apparent here. And so we see this sort of tripole-like pattern, which can potentially be linked to ENSO, and that seems somewhat consistent with the proxy data. So we also noted that the timing of the rainfall changes that we found in our proxy record, again shown up here, had strong similarities with records linked to the African monsoon. In particular, delta D of leaf wax records from a number of sites shown up here in blue and orange, as well as dust records, which are shown over here from Mount Kilimanjaro, Gulf of Oman, the Nile Delta, all show similar timing, similarly timed shifts to our record in Southeast Asia. And so because this paper by Francesco Posada had recently been published, we were wondering, so this paper argued that the greening of the Sahara that occurred during the African human period suppressed ENSO activity during the mid-Holocene, and they conducted some model experiments to try and test the impact of changing dust and vegetation over North Africa on climate and on the water circulation. And so our hypothesis, therefore, was kind of the opposite. So if the Green Sahara led to suppressed ENSO activity, did the demise of the Green Sahara and the aridification, which you can see as dust increases, as well as delta D of leaf wax increases, did the aridification then somehow contribute to increasing ENSO? And we know that our study site is strongly influenced by ENSO. So that was the hypothesis. And so we, together with Francesco Posada, we looked at the climate model output, comparing these two runs, basically with altered vegetation and dust being the main difference between the two simulations. And we found that the reduced vegetation and increased dust after the end of the human period led to cooling in the Indian Ocean. You can see that in this temperature, delta temperature record over here. So we have widespread cooling. And also we have widespread drying, of course, over North Africa, but also it extends over into much of Central Asia. These numbers are showing the location of other sites which exhibited dry conditions during that time. And so we linked this shift in the water circulation to widespread drying over Eurasia, which was effectively driven by the cooling in the Indian Ocean and could potentially have led to societal shifts here and elsewhere. And then I won't go into more of the dynamics about it, but I would, if you're interested, I'm happy to answer questions, or you can read the paper. In any case, just to summarize these two case studies, the TM Delta 18 records reflect large-scale Asian monsoon intensity through the upstream rainout mechanism, we believe. And then we use multiple proxies, including carbon isotopes, trace elements, radiocarbon, which are more indicative of local water balance and can help constrain some of these processes, along with cave monitoring work, which I didn't have time to talk much about. And then we found that the evidence points towards weak monsoon and locally dry conditions during Heinrich stadials, so kind of monsoon intensity and local hydroclimate shifting together on millennial timescales, but a strong monsoon and locally dry conditions during the early Holocene insolation maxima, suggesting that there could be some decoupling or decoupling of sort of monsoon intensity with local hydroclimate on orbital timescales. And we hope to eventually have longer records spanning, I don't know if we'll ever get to the equivalent of what we have in China, but that would take my whole career, I'm sure. But in any case, we hope to continue looking into that. And then on more recent timescales, we found evidence for a large megadrought in Northern Laos from 5 to 3.3 thousand years ago that we think may be dynamically linked to the end of the Green Sahara. And then I would like to say, one more time, I'd like to acknowledge all of my students and collaborators across the world, and many in Laos and Southeast Asia, especially Sangpan and Norsang here, who have accompanied us on many of our field trips, who are part of the MEP project, as well as other MEP project members here. My collaborator, Michael Griffiths, my former students, Chris and Jessica and Hung Ying, who I just realized isn't pictured. This is what we typically look like after a day of field work. It's quite exhausting, but fun. And then I'm showing a picture of some of my current students and undergraduates who are working. And then, of course, I have to always acknowledge our spider friends to keep them happy, so they stay far away from me when I'm in the cave.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. This was a great presentation.
Thank you. You think I'm done, but I have 2 more slides just really quickly.
Oh,
I wanted to just do a quick advertisement for those of you who might be going to AGU in person or online. We have 2 monsoon related presentations, one led by my student Elizabeth Patterson, who you can hopefully see in the upper right, although it might be behind your video. So Elizabeth is a current PhD student in our lab who is working on records from central Vietnam, which is much more influenced by fall and winter rainfall delivered from northeasterly winds from the Pacific and South China Sea. And we have this amazing sample that we actually were very lucky to collect in March 2020. We made it back from field work just about 1 week or less than a week before everything kind of shut down. And so she got to spend much of her pandemic working on this sample. And we have a really beautiful and interesting new record, which looks very different from the records in Laos. So if you'd like to learn more about that, I encourage you to swing by if you're going to be at AGU. And then I also have my postdoc, Annabelle Wolf, who just completed her PhD in the UK with Lika Ersek on Vietnamese speleothems, and we'll be presenting some of that work that we've done in collaboration with them. Again, looking for evidence of finding evidence that potentially we also see that megadrought event showing up in Vietnam, but digging into some of the complexities of how you can sort of deconvolve the summer and the winter monsoon signals using oxygen isotopes versus other proxies. So with that, I will happily take any questions.
I think we already have a question from Antje Volker if she would like to ask it herself. If not, I can read it, and that goes for everybody. Please raise your hand or intervene or send me the questions. I'll read them for you. Antje?
So for me, it's not really a question, it's just a comment, because when you were talking about your 5.3 event and that you don't really see the 4.2, it just reminded me about a talk I heard from Lomi Johnson like over 10 years ago. And if I remember it correctly, he always was saying they get a much stronger signal in at least some of the ice cores at 5.3 and not 4.2. And that kind of fits perfectly with what you are saying.
Yeah, interesting. So this plot does have the Kilimanjaro ice core data on it, which does have a bit of a signal there. You're correct. Or no, this is the Kilimanjaro, so it's quite low there. But I'll have to look into that. Thank you.
Yeah, it might be look into the one maybe from South America or something. It's like or the Tibet. Tibet, you probably looked. It might have been the South American ones that had the stronger signal.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely worth looking at. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions, please? I would say that I'm happy to see work coming from that part of the world that's so complicated. It seems that argues for multi-proxy approaches that could, in the end, revolutionize the speleothe work.
Yeah, I'm constantly pushing for folks to publish their carbon isotope data. And also, which doesn't always happen, and also, yeah, consider using additional proxies. And so I think more people are doing so, and it's not always straightforward either, unfortunately, but we're lucky that in this case, it seems to be telling a reasonably consistent story. So.
Yeah, this should lead to the same thing happens in the ocean with multiple proxies, and should lead to convergence between the two worlds.
Yes, that would be nice.
Courage, any questions? Everybody preparing to cook the turkey? Or it's too early?
That's what I'm going to be doing after this.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, no, thanks everyone for coming on the day before Thanksgiving for those in the US.
Well, if there are no questions at this point, I would like to say a few words about next talk that is going to happen on December 1st. We will be happy to host Anil Gupta, and he is going to be talking about late quaternary Indian monsoon variability and its influence on South Asian societies. Looking forward to that, and would like to thank again Kathleen and wish everybody that has a holiday at the horizon happy Thanksgiving, and for the other folks, enjoy your rest of the week, and we'll see you soon on December 1st. Bye.